Hello and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to share with you the 5 signs that had me convinced that my daughter was autistic more than 12 months before her official diagnosis. There are 2 key factors to mention before we start. Firstly, my daughter was born at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, so the first 2 years of her life were spent in sporadic lockdowns and isolation. This affected how our general practitioner viewed her overall progress because it was difficult to say whether the differences in her development were due to a lack of exposure to adults, peers, play settings, and social situations, or something more. Secondly, while I am an experienced special educator, my autistic daughter is my eldest child. I spent almost no time with children under the age of 5 until she was born and had no idea what neurotypical development looked like in the first 12 months of a child's life. In short, my familiarity with autism was of little help in that first year. That said, even with the COVID-19 pandemic muddying the waters and my total lack of expertise as a parent, from the time that my daughter was approximately 1 year old, there were 5 signs that became harder and harder to ignore, right up until her official assessment and diagnosis at almost 3 years of age. I've tried to introduce them in the chronological order in which they appeared, or at least in the order in which I first noticed them. The signs. 1. Not answering to her name at 12 months of age. This was the very first sign for me that something was different about my daughter. Though our socializing was limited due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I couldn't help but notice that most babies, whether in the supermarket, doctor's office, or other public places, seemed to respond instantly by looking up, turning their heads, or stopping what they were doing when a parent or carer called their name. I would say my daughter's name repeatedly, getting physically closer to her each time, but even when I was crouched right in front of her, she rarely, if ever, seemed to register that I was trying to get her attention. 2. A lack of nonverbal language. Another thing that I continually noticed other children, and particularly babies, doing was engaging in nonverbal communication, such as pointing. They'd point up as an aeroplane flew past, at food and objects that they wanted, and at their parents and carers, all while making meaningful eye contact with the person they were communicating with. They would offer food and toys to adults around them, stretching their little arms out and using a direct gaze to make sure that their message was being received. They would nod eagerly for yes and shake their heads firmly for no. They were constantly communicating without words that they wanted to share and show what they had and what was happening around them. My daughter never did this, pointing, showing, sharing, nodding, or shaking her head, not once, and when I pointed things out to her, most of the time she wouldn't look or appear to register that I'd spoken to her. She would certainly accept things from me, but usually with no eye contact and without the thankful smile that I had witnessed other children easily bestowing on adults around them. This isn't to say that she never laughed or smiled. She did both of these things regularly and appeared outwardly content and happy the vast majority of the time. In hindsight, which of course is 2020, this was one of the things that masked her autism. 3. Limited verbal language. Of all of the development areas, this was the most ambiguous for me as a mother. Speech is something that develops at various rates for individual children and can be affected by a number of factors such as low muscle tone, oral motor problems, hearing ability, and intellectual functioning, as well as autism. That said, from the time my daughter was around 18 months old, I became increasingly concerned about her speech. Specifically, she communicated using only single words, never phrases. She spoke only a small number of words, that is, less than 10. Her pronunciation was difficult to understand at the best of times, and she never used the words yes and no, but instead used the word off for no and the word on for yes. This sign quickly became the reddest of the red flags. 4. No pretend or imaginary play. Around the same time, that is, 18 months of age, I also observed that my daughter did not want to engage in pretend play with me, whether it was feeding a doll or brushing its hair, pushing toy cars along a track, cooking with play utensils, using a bucket and spade, or placing things in and out of containers. She would quickly move away from me and the activity. Instead, she liked to spin objects and roll things along the floor. It was on one of the countless occasions of trying repeatedly and unsuccessfully to engage her in imaginary play that the word autism popped into my head for the first time. 5. Gross, fine, and oral motor skills. The fifth and final sign I've placed last because I think about this one more as a hindsight sign, as on its own, it's not necessarily an indicator of autism. My daughter was a late crawler and a late walker, though still within what is considered the typical range. But the differences in her motor skills to a neurotypical child went beyond these two milestones. Again, from around 18 months, I noticed that she had very little strength in her fingers and hands, and that her coordination was such that she could not climb play equipment or push herself on a tricycle. She found it very hard to open and close things and hold larger pieces of food. Around this time, her first sensory sensitivities also appeared, related to her fine and oral motor skills. It became evident that she did not like touching wet or sticky substances or biting into large pieces of food. Instead, she preferred to touch only dry materials and eat bite-sized foods. If I was going to give you a sixth sign that my daughter was autistic, it would be to do with her sensory differences, but as they largely appeared after the age of 2, I won't go into more detail in this video, as here I'm focusing on the very earliest signs. So these were the 5 signs that when I put them all together had me strongly suspecting that my daughter was autistic before she was 2 years of age. I say together because in isolation I'm not sure that just 1 or even 2 of these signs would have led me to the same conclusion, but in the context of her as an individual, they became harder and harder to ignore until I eventually decided to investigate the possibility of an autism diagnosis. This diagnosis turned out to be an absolute blessing, as my daughter has received incredible professional support and is now thriving and better understood as well as being loved. As always, I'd love to read any comments you might have about this topic, and if you're weighing up pursuing a diagnosis for your child or wondering how the NDIS process works, I'll link my videos about these below. Until next time.